Hi, and welcome to another episode of Paul's Treehouse. My name is Paul Siegel, and today I wanted to talk about art and what is art. I find it constantly frustrating as an artist to find that in the year 2019 we still don't have a clear definition of what art is. And I think because of that, we've been able to use the title of art and wrap it around things that, in my opinion, are not art. This is why words and definitions are important. Although, yes, language has a way of dividing the world into little bits and pieces that we can understand. But the more we define things, the more clarity we can have when we communicate. But language is always going to have its limitations. There are always things that we will not really be able to fully express. And I would argue that even now, as far as language has been developed, we are still unable to express at least half of what there is to express about the human experience. I think we have a long way to go before we can actually fully explain and express ourselves fully. But that's what language is attempting to do. We're trying to develop language to a place where it can express us more fully, more precisely, with more exactitude, with less vagueness, and less obscurity, and more clarity. Alan Watts said something that I really like. He said poetry and writing in general is the art of saying something that could never be said, or that you couldn't, writing something that couldn't be written down, is how he defined poetry. I'm paraphrasing, so you'll have to look it up. But essentially trying to say that as a writer, what you're attempting to do with words is to express something that nobody thought words could actually express. That's where you're sort of pushing, taking that medium and using it to express something that is beyond its own capacity to express, extend beyond its limitation as a medium, as a language. And I personally believe that therein lies the definition of art. So, for example, whenever you can take some sort of medium and have it transcend itself to a higher level, to a higher dimension, you are starting to enter the realm of creating art. So, for example, a sheet of paper is a two-dimensional, flat, emotionless object. What if you were able to draw something on that sheet of paper that upon looking at the sheet of paper, you thought you were actually seeing a three-dimensional object sitting on that sheet of paper? Famously once defined that art is a lie that reveals the truth. And I think what he's trying to say is something along these lines, that you're fooling the viewer or the listener that there is something there that isn't really there. It's kind of like a magic trick in a way. And so, in my opinion, if we were going to find a way of defining what art is, I would personally define it this way, that art, you begin to create art once what you are producing, whether it be sculpturally, on paper, in any medium, choose whatever medium you want. If you are beginning to transcend that medium into a higher dimension than the medium itself, then you are starting to enter the realm of art. And the more of these dimensions you are able to penetrate through your medium, the more of an art it is. And I think this is why art has been so difficult to define. It is because it's not really a is or not. It's not on or off. It's a spectrum. And so you can journey into the realm of what is art, and you can go on for infinity. It's like going from dark to light. You can approach the light, and it just gets brighter and brighter and brighter. But it's like if the light had an infinite brightness. Because ultimately, the number of dimensions that exceed the dimensions we are ourselves aware of, we have to assume are infinite. So what are some other examples? I have a variety of art books here by artists that I really enjoy. And I thought that I'd go through them and kind of express what dimensions each of these artists were crossing, and why what they did was art. So Leonardo da Vinci, I'm sure everybody who's watching this video has heard the name because he's one of the most famous artists. And of all the examples I have today, he's probably the least artistic. I would define Leonardo da Vinci as more of a technical artist than a fully realized artist, because the dimension that he crossed in his art was the one I just described, of taking something, a flat surface, and conveying three-dimensionality out of it in a manner that nobody could at the time. And even to this day, it's really difficult to convey the three-dimensional form that he was able to reproduce on canvas. There are other dimensions, of course, not only that of switching between two dimensions and three-dimensional forms, but there's the dimension of story, there's the dimension of time, there's the dimension of human character and personality. And Leonardo da Vinci didn't really cross any of those. And so he just barely entered the realm of what is art, in my opinion. In fact, if you look at all of his characters' faces, whether it be from the females to the males, to the adults, the older people, and the children, they all have the exact same personality, the exact same character. And what that tells me is that Leonardo da Vinci wasn't really interested in truly exploring the human condition. He was mostly interested in the world of forms, in the world of geometry, in understanding shape. And I think this is why ultimately his greatest achievement was to create forms that could be tools, either of war or automation in the time that he was living. And so, in my opinion, Leonardo da Vinci is first an inventor. And we could also say somewhat of an artist, but mostly an inventor and a technical artist is how I would define Leonardo da Vinci. If we take by contrast someone like Rembrandt, who also has a similar, if not greater, technical ability to reproduce three-dimensional form on the canvas, Rembrandt did something that crossed over a variety of other dimensions. He could tell a story. You could look into the eyes of his characters and you could feel a history there. You could almost look at the character's face and know where they come from, know perhaps what they're thinking in the moment. And this is an amazing moment in art, when artists were getting so good technically that they could reproduce the three-dimensional form, capture light and shadow, and produce that lie that reveals the truth. They took it further yet. Artists like Rembrandt did anyway, where they started to portray the human soul, the human character, and at a much deeper level, the human condition, but also movement. If you look at a lot of his works, the characters are in the middle of doing something. And so that is another dimension. The two-dimensional form isn't only flat, but it's also static. And so with his art, not only was he able to portray three dimensions, he was able to portray the human personality of individual characters in the scene. He was able to portray them moving, and there was an action. You could just look at this static image and feel a story taking place. It was like one of those time-lapse photos that you can do on the iPhone, where it kind of shows you a little bit of the movement. And so Rembrandt started to cross many, many dimensions of his medium. And so as an artist, he was tremendous and one of the greatest there ever was. So not only 3 dimensions, he could portray light and shadow. He could portray the human character, the human personality. He could portray story. He could portray the passage of time by illustrating movement. All of these dimensions he crossed with his art. And that's one of the things that makes him, in my opinion, an artist, is he was able to cross many of those dimensions. Now we look at an artist like Cezanne, who I absolutely love. I love these works. Cezanne came during a time when artists had sort of been there, done that. The camera was starting to come into use. Artists were showing their capacity to create the 3-dimensional form and to cross all these barriers. And Cezanne was interested, yeah, I get it. I get that we can do that we can portray the 3-dimensional form. But I'm interested in something else. And in my opinion, Cezanne was really interested in the 2-dimensional aspect of our retina. So even though the world is 3-dimensional, he knew, and science knew at the time, how the eye worked. And he knew that all of this light was hitting the back of our eyes on a 2-dimensional surface. And so even though we think we're seeing in 3 dimensions, we're actually reconstructing those shapes in our brain mostly after they get projected on a 2-dimensional plane on our retina. And I think he was I don't know. I mean, I never, no one's ever asked him, I don't think. But when I look at his art, this is what I see. I see that he's fascinated with the interplay of the 2-dimensional shapes that emerge through a 3-dimensional world when projected on a 2-dimensional retina. You've probably noticed when you stare at something for a long time and then close your eyes, the inverted image is showing up very briefly. Or there are other times when you'll be looking at a particular color and you put another color beside it, and that color all of a sudden starts to look different. That's called simultaneous contrast. And these are symptoms of the way the eye is working to deconstruct what it sees into something that is meaningful for the brain. And I think Cezanne picked up on this. So he's not only trying to portray very nicely 3-dimensional forms, but in the process of portraying those 3-dimensional forms, he's also portraying the 2-dimensional manifestation those forms have in our retina by playing with the arrangements of shapes and lines in a very geometric way. Even if you look at this cluster of trees, you can find very clear geometric shapes hidden within them, squares, triangles. And so he's taking the 3-dimensional forms and he's pushing against them 2-dimensional shapes so that to lock them on a 2-dimensional, back on a 2-dimensional grid. It's almost like taking something, making it 3-dimensional, and then pushing it back and flattening it against a surface so that you're forced to have everything on the exact same plane. So he wasn't really interested in portraying depth. It was almost like taking something 3-dimensional and then flattening it back onto a 2-dimensional form. Because I think this is how he saw things. He was so intimately aware of the fact that his eyes were seeing things in shapes that he really wanted to portray that in his art. That's how he felt the world was a good way to see. And so Cezanne not only crossed the barrier from 2D to 3-dimensional portrayal, He also started to play with, what could we call this? He started to cross over into the realm of psychology and play with the mind of the viewer. Because he knew so well how the eyes saw the world, because he was intimately connected to that himself, he was able to leverage that in his art and get to control how you would see the works. So I think that's enough of Cézanne. Now, artists like Monet were very similar in that Monet, Manet, and a lot of the Impressionists had also understood that it was possible to cross that boundary from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. But what they were proposing through their art is that, well, line, shape, light, dark, these are ways that artists like Rembrandt, artists like Da Vinci had mastered, but they wanted to explore something completely different. They wanted to achieve the exact same effect in the sense of crossing over from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, but they wanted to do it purely through color. And something really cool happened when the Impressionists started doing this, because for the first time in art, you started not only to see 3-dimensional forms manifest on the 2-dimensional plane, but you started to pick up on the atmosphere. And so it wasn't only portraying forms, it was portraying all the negative space that artists before the Impressionists were completely not even paying attention to. So for the first time, the Impressionists painted oxygen. They were able to portray what you can't see. And this is very similar to what I was saying earlier with what Alan Watts said about poetry being the art of saying what could not possibly be said. How do you say something that cannot possibly be said? Would perhaps be a good definition for the art of poetry. The Impressionist painters did that with paint. They were able to portray what you can't see. The very air that we breathe, they were able to paint. And the way they did this was they relied on color. If we look at artists like Degas, in my opinion, is like Monet with chalk, and also a different set of subject matter. He was mostly interested in the female body, whereas Monet was interested in nature. So they took color, no matter the medium, whether it be chalk, whether it be paint. They took color and they portrayed within the color everything they needed to. Where light was hitting, where shadow was hitting. It wasn't about getting a color in and lightening it and darkening it. It was really about the color that you place on the canvas is either the light or is the dark or somewhere in between, but it's the color that matters. The color is going to contain the hue, it's going to contain the value, and it's going to represent the material that it's supposed to be representing, whether it be fabric or skin. And so because they use such a consistent approach throughout the canvas, it really removed the hierarchy of all the elements in the composition to a place where it was all very much shared. And it's kind of similar to, let's say, if you can do this in black and white, for example. If you were to do an illustration and every single mark was a vertical line of different thicknesses. So if you went through and just did nothing but vertical lines of different thicknesses, and when you get further away, you can start to see the formation of an image. Or Pointless did this with points, where you just put points of color and value. And that would be a very technical attempt to produce what the Impressionists did, which is to portray everything in such an even and equitable manner that you start to almost feel like you can breathe through the canvas and everything is sharing the same oxygen. So a number of dimensions were crossed by the Impressionists in that sense. And then we have someone like Toulouse-Lautrec, who is, to an extent, interested in the three-dimensionality of things, but not much. The dimension that Toulouse-Lautrec is trying to cross is the dimension of movement. And so I think that's why he ended up gravitating more toward line and figuring out exactly how to draw a line and vary its thickness from thick to thin in such a way that would portray movement, which is a huge dimension to be able to cross on a static surface. Lautrec's portrayal of movement far exceeds Rembrandt's, for example. If you look at Rembrandt's work and compare it to Lautrec's, they feel static in comparison. You start seeing artists like Lautrec come about, and you start to see the potential that the two-dimensional art form has for portraying movement. Now, I could keep going with these examples, but let's skip on to sculpture and artists like Michelangelo. Now, in my opinion, Michelangelo is trying to cross over a dimension that is largely imaginary, and that is the dimension of the realm of angels and the realm of Judeo-Christian ideas. And so he's more of an artist entering the realm of prophethood in that sense. He's someone who's trying to convey religious principles through his art. And so whether that is valuable to you or not will determine how valuable his art is to you. And so if you, because those are the dimensions that he's trying to cross. But the reason I bring him up as an example is because he was primarily a sculptor, and that's really the realm at which he shined. We often think of Michelangelo as more of a painter because of the Sistine Chapel, but really his greatest accomplishments were his sculptures. Think of it. Take a sheet of paper. You could probably learn how to draw something that looks three-dimensional. If you look at my videos on perspective, I could show you techniques. You can follow those techniques and produce something three-dimensional on paper. Take marble, a really tough stone and heavy stone, and turn it into this, a rock, which is completely a static object. No emotion, no specific form that is recognizable. And turn it into a sculpture like the David. Which, in my opinion, is technically one of the greatest sculptures ever made. If we went into the realm of sculpture, there are other artists that did things like Rembrandt did, where they were able to portray movement and personality and character and story. That wasn't really Michelangelo's strong suit with sculpture. But he was able to take rock and turn it into beautiful, three-dimensional, recognizable forms. They may have not had much personality, they may have not had much movement or emotion, because fundamentally what was driving him was the desire to record and portray religious history and lore through his art, because that's what he valued. That's what he valued most, and that was the dimension that he was mostly trying to cross, in addition to the obvious one of being able to take something like rock and turn it into a beautiful shape like this. So I think that is a great lens through which to define art. We need to go back to understanding what art really is, and therefore what it's not. And so the more dimensions you cross with your medium, the more of an art it is. So I hope that with that, you can move forward and be able to truly discriminate and understand what is art, what is not. If you disagree with me, please leave your response in the comments. I'm more than happy to be wrong. I've been wrong many times in the past. And so I'm definitely genuinely curious what you think about this, because it is kind of a new idea, and the definitions of art that are out there are not satisfactory to me. They're very vague, and they leave way too much room for interpretation, and I think that's why the realm of the arts has been decaying and decaying. We could even look at this in the realm of theatrical arts, which is, if you think about it, if you think about the stage as a canvas and the characters as the sculptures, the people as the sculptures, they're already moving, they're already talking. So the art of acting and the art of staging and the art of theater and the art of film, what dimensions are these art forms crossing? Well, in my opinion, they're crossing over through the dimension of time, because you can sit down for 90 minutes and feel like you've experienced a story that took place over many years. That's the dimension that these art forms are trying to cross. But more and more you're finding that movies are getting longer and longer and longer, and that to me is an indication that we're getting worse at the art form itself, because we're missing the point. The point of the art form itself is to be able to tell, if you're a great storyteller, centuries worth of story compressed in a short amount of time. That's fundamentally the function of story. It's something that we can use as a tool to make it seem like you've experienced a whole lifetime in someone else's shoes, and either learn from their mistakes, from their trials, or from their successes, and not have to undergo those things yourself. You're able to take that story and learn from it and grow from it as if you had lived someone else's life for a brief period of time. But lately, story has become more and more some sort of like a junk food for the senses, is maybe how I would describe it. A junk food for your ears, for your eyes, for your mind, and something goes, ooh, pretty, you know, and just kind of keep you kind of a little bit hypnotized, but not really trying to give you anything of actual value. And so I think it's important that we understand what art is, and that's why I wanted to make this video. I hope you found it helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.